Okay, hi everybody. This is our last screencast on the Cold War. There's not much left for me to go over here. So we're going to wrap up these slides in this screencast. There's going to be some questions in a Google form for you to answer afterward. And then our next assignment will be a study guide on the Cold War. And then we're going to have a test. And I'll post that on Monday next week. So for the end of the Cold War, we are picking up with President Richard Nixon. He was elected in 1968. I did talk about him in the Vietnam War screencast. And so we're picking up with him again. And his policy of détente, that is number 2 there, détente, a policy aimed at easing Cold War tensions. And if you were taking the Regents exam, which we are not, I would say that the Regents exam loves to ask about the purpose of President Nixon's policy of détente. All right, so Nixon wants to calm things down between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there are 2 things he did to make this policy successful. The first is that he was the first president to travel to communist China. And he went with his wife. And you can see there in the picture that they are on the Great Wall in China, and she's wearing a red coat, which is no mistake. She did that on purpose. Red is the color of communism. And so this trip to China was meant to show the rest of the world that the United States can have friendly relationships with communist countries. And on the right, we have a picture of Nixon shaking hands with the communist leader of China, Mao Zedong. After he went to China, Nixon visited the Soviet Union. And when he did that, he met with the Soviet leader at the time. His last name was Brezhnev. And they are seen here in this picture signing the first SALT treaty. There were 2 SALT treaties. The second one fell apart. You may, if you did the summaries on the end of the Cold War, there was a little bit mentioned about the SALT II treaty that fell apart between President Carter and the Soviet Union. But we're going to focus on SALT I. All right. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. At this point in the late 1960s and in the 1970s, the main problem with ending the Cold War was all of the nuclear weapons that both the United States and the Soviet Union were still continuing to build, and the threat of nuclear war and destroying really potentially the whole world. And so this SALT treaty was a 5-year agreement which limited the number of weapons that the United States or the Soviet Union could have. Okay, shifting over to Germany. This is a major event in the end of the Cold War. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had been built by the Soviet Union back in 1961 to separate East and West Berlin, came down. And East and West Berlin were united into one city, and the entire country of Germany was also reunited. The city of Berlin had been divided by the wall into East and West, and the country had also been divided into East and West. So this was brought about by some revolutions in surrounding countries around Germany. One was Poland, the other was Hungary. They overthrew their communist governments in those countries, and that made the East Germans think, hey, maybe this is our time to do the same. And so massive protests of 70,000 people or more started. People started coming and showing up at the wall. And eventually the East German government made an announcement that they could pass through, and for the guards on the east, the side of East Berlin to move out of the way and let the people through. And so there was this huge rush of people from the east side of the wall to the west side of the wall. And then people on the east side of the wall started, from both sides, they got up on the wall, and eventually a section by section, it was removed. All right. So again, if we were taking a Regents exam, they do like to ask what symbolized an ending to the Cold War, and the fall of the Berlin Wall is considered a symbol of the end of the Cold War and the failure of communism. Because if the wall was built to keep people in the east side of Berlin under communism, well, now the wall has come down. Communism has failed, right, in East Berlin and in East Germany. Okay, 2 years later, 1991, the Soviet Union has another new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he introduced 2 new policies to the Soviet Union, which were steps moving away from communism. One was glasnost, which means openness, and that involved more freedom of the press in the Soviet Union, allowing people to criticize what was an already failing government system. And the second policy Gorbachev introduced was perestroika, which was a restructuring of the communist economy that allowed individual citizens to own their own businesses, which really had not been done before. Okay, so for these 2 reasons, historians say that the Soviet Union collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union, and there was no more Soviet Union then. If it collapsed, I'm going to show you a map here. The breakup of the Soviet Union. This shows all of the countries that are in color together had made up the Soviet Union. And when it collapsed or broke up, we have still Russia remaining as a very large country, and then several smaller countries in what was known as that Eastern Bloc, or those satellite nations that the Soviet Union had really pressured into forming communist governments under their control, ultimately. So you can see there some of the other smaller countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan. Okay, so all of these new, smaller, independent countries were formed with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Okay, so that large country, Russia, that was still left, elected a new president upon the breakup of the Soviet Union. That president, now, if you notice on this slide, it says Russian president, right? Not Soviet president, because there is no more Soviet Union. So we're referring to Russia again. And their new president was Boris Yeltsin. And in 1992, he signed an official statement with our president, the first George Bush. And this statement declared an official end to the Cold War, and both leaders agreed to reduce our nuclear weapons by 2/3. So officially, the Cold War ends in 1992. It began in 1945, immediately following World War II. So this was, about a 50-year conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, now put to rest. So that is it for the end of the Cold War. Make sure you go to the Google form and answer the questions, and you'll be all set for this assignment. And then look for the study guide to come out on Thursday. All right. Thanks, guys. Miss you all.